The lights of the most exclusive restaurant on Wall Street shimmered against polished glasses and golden cutlery. At the center table sat Charles Whitmore, once a titan of industry, now a CEO gasping for air as his empire crumbled. His voice trembled as he tried to reassure ruthless investors, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. Their laughter was sharp, merciless, slicing through what was left of his pride. And then, it happened. As his words faltered and his future seemed seconds from collapse, a quiet voice broke the tension. "Can I help?" It wasn't another billionaire or a Wall Street shark. It was Sophia, the waitress, holding a tray of empty glasses. Her uniform was plain, her hair hastily tied back. To the investors, she was invisible. To Charles, she was the last person who should dare to speak. The table erupted in sneers and ridicule. A waitress? Offering to save a corporation worth billions? It was absurd. But what no one knew was that Sophia carried a hidden brilliance, one that would not only silence their mockery, but also spark the most unexpected turnaround in corporate history. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, echoing through the opulent dining room like the jeers of an unforgiving jury. Charles Whitmore, sitting stiffly in his chair, tried to muster authority, but his voice cracked again. Elaine Crawford, the investor with diamond earrings that gleamed as sharply as her tongue, leaned forward with a smirk. "Charles, is this what your board meetings have come to? Taking business advice from the waitstaff?" Her words dripped with venom, and the table erupted in another round of cruel chuckles. Charles clenched his jaw. Once he was the man everyone feared, the one whose decisions moved markets. Now, his company's plummeting stock price and failed projects left him exposed. These investors weren't allies anymore, they were vultures circling a dying beast. Sophia stood frozen, tray in hand, her cheeks flushing. She had only spoken because she couldn't stand watching a man drown while others pushed his head underwater. But the moment the words left her lips, she became the target. One executive, a barrel-chested man in a pinstripe suit, raised his glass. "Maybe she can balance the books better than you, Whitmore. What do you say, darling? Want to manage $1 billion portfolio with those hands?" His gaze lingered uncomfortably long on Sophia, making the cruelty sting even sharper. Sophia lowered her eyes. She knew her place, or rather, the place the world had assigned to her. Invisible servant. Silent shadow. Certainly not a voice in the affairs of the elite. But inside, her mind raced. She saw the flaws in Charles's desperate pitch, the missed opportunities no one at this gilded table had the humility to recognize. And that quiet certainty inside her was stronger than their laughter. Charles, meanwhile, felt the room closing in. He was choking, not just on their ridicule, but on the weight of his failures. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass, trying to hide the shake. The investors had smelled blood for months, but now, tonight, they wanted to kill. Elaine's smirk widened. "Let's make this interesting," she said, swirling her glass lazily. "If the waitress thinks she can help, let's give her a chance. Charles, since you've clearly run out of ideas, why don't we let her pitch her brilliant solution? We could all use some entertainment." The others howled with laughter, pounding the table in mock approval. To them, this was nothing more than sport, watching a nobody humiliate herself before giants. Charles wanted to refuse, to tell Sophia to stay in her lane, but his pride was already shattered. What harm could it do? At least the attention would shift off his collapsing authority. He glanced at Sophia, his eyes a mixture of pity and resentment. "Fine," he muttered, his voice tight. "You think you can help? Then say something." Sophia's pulse raced. She had been mocked, dismissed, and now challenged publicly. Around her, every mocking face expected her to shrink, to apologize, to retreat into silence. But instead, she took a slow breath, set her tray down carefully on the side station, and straightened her posture. The restaurant seemed to hush, waiting for the spectacle. To the investors, this was a game. To Charles, it was one more humiliation. But for Sophia, it was a moment that felt strangely inevitable. She looked at the CEO who had everything to lose, then at the predators circling him. Her voice, when it came, was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "All right," she said softly, but firmly enough for them to hear. "I will." The laughter stopped, replaced by a silence sharper than any insult. Every eye turned to her, waiting for the collapse, for the embarrassment that would confirm their superiority. And just like that, the impossible challenge had been set, a waitress against the titans of Wall Street. Have you ever felt underestimated? Like your voice didn't matter, or that others laughed at the very thought of you having something valuable to say? That's exactly what Sophia is facing right now, a room full of powerful people who expect her to fail. And if you're curious to see how she turns this humiliation into something unforgettable, make sure you subscribe right now. Because stories like this, stories of courage rising from the most unexpected places, are what we share here. Don't miss the moment Sophia proves them all wrong. Sophia could feel the weight of every mocking gaze pressing down on her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly folded her hands in front of her and let her eyes scan the table. She saw the stack of untouched reports Charles had brought, the hastily scribbled figures in the margins, the nervous twitch in his jaw. It was all there, the desperation, the blind spots, the arrogance of men and women who thought they knew everything. "I'm not here to entertain you," she began, her voice quiet yet unshakable. "I'm here because I see something you're all missing." The room bristled. Elaine leaned back in her chair, eyebrows raised, her smirk daring Sophia to continue. Charles shifted uncomfortably, torn between humiliation and an odd flicker of curiosity. Sophia reached for one of the investor packets on the table. She flipped it open, scanning the numbers with practiced ease. Her father's struggling hardware store flashed in her memory, late nights balancing ledgers, negotiating with creditors, finding creative ways to keep the doors open. It wasn't Wall Street, but the principles were the same. Money didn't care about prestige, it cared about discipline, clarity, and vision. "You're bleeding cash in 3 divisions," she said, tapping the report with her fingertip. "But instead of restructuring, you've been throwing money at vanity projects to impress investors. That's why you're in this hole. Not because the market turned, not because of luck, because of pride." The table erupted in murmurs. One executive scoffed openly. "And you learned that where? Between serving appetizers?" Sophia met his gaze without flinching. "I learned it watching small businesses collapse because they believed the same lies you tell yourselves. Growth at any cost, expansion without stability. You think bigger always means better. But sometimes the smartest move is to cut back, stabilize, and build again." For the first time all evening, the mockery faltered. A silence spread, uneasy, but real. Charles leaned forward, studying her more closely. There was a precision in her words that couldn't be faked, a clarity he hadn't heard from his own advisors in months. Elaine's smirk returned, though tighter now. "Interesting," she purred. "But talk is cheap. What would you actually do, waitress, if you were in his position?" Sophia inhaled, steadying herself. This was the moment, the line between ridicule and revelation. "First, I'd stop wasting resources on the prestige projects bleeding this company dry. Then, I'd focus on the division with the highest cash flow potential, your logistics arm. It's undervalued, underfunded, and buried under bureaucracy. Streamline it, invest in efficiency, and it could carry the weight while the rest stabilizes." A ripple of surprise moved through the table. One of the quieter investors, a man known more for observation than bluster, leaned in. "That actually makes sense," he murmured, almost to himself. Charles's throat tightened. Could it be? Could this waitress, someone utterly outside their world, see what he and his high-priced advisors had missed? His pride wanted to dismiss her, but his instinct whispered otherwise. Sophia wasn't finished. Her eyes sharpened as she spoke, her words gaining confidence with every syllable. "You're all so obsessed with appearances that you've forgotten the fundamentals. Stability. Sustainability. Purpose. Without those, no amount of spend or investors' money will save you. And I think deep down, you already know that." The silence that followed was different this time. Heavy. Unsettled. Like the first crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. For the first time, the titans of Wall Street weren't laughing. The restaurant felt different now. The sneers had faded, replaced by an uneasy quiet that no one at the table had expected. Sophia, the girl who moments earlier was the butt of their jokes, stood taller, her voice carrying a calm authority that forced even the most arrogant to listen. Elaine's fingers tapped against her wine glass. She wasn't ready to concede. "Nice theory," she said coolly. "But strategy without execution is just a bedtime story. What makes you think you could actually pull this off?" Sophia met her gaze evenly. "Because I've done it before. On a smaller scale, yes. My father's business was weeks from bankruptcy. I cut waste, restructured debts, and invested where the returns were strongest. It didn't make us rich, but it saved his company and his employees' jobs. The scale is different here, but the principles are the same. Numbers don't lie, pride does." Her words landed with the weight of truth. Even the cynical faces around the table softened, just slightly. One investor who had been quiet until now leaned back and studied her closely. He was no ordinary guest, Victor Lang, a respected turnaround specialist, known for sniffing out both fraud and brilliance. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "She's right," Victor said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I've reviewed Whitmore's reports myself, and the logistics division is the only piece worth saving. It's underutilized, but with the right restructuring, it could stabilize the entire company." I didn't expect to hear it from a waitress, but her assessment is sharper than half the consultants Charles has paid millions to. The room shifted again. This time, the balance of power tilted. The mockery had vanished, curiosity and even respect flickered where arrogance once dominated. Charles's chest tightened. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair, hope. Humbling, bruising hope, delivered not by his board, not by his investors, but by a young woman in a plain uniform. Elaine's smirk faltered. She raised her chin, unwilling to admit defeat. "One lucky guess doesn't make her a savior," she hissed. But the others weren't so sure. Murmurs spread. Investors whispered, weighing her words. Could it be true? Could the salvation of a billion-dollar corporation really lie in the inside of someone who carried trays instead of briefcases? Sophia didn't push further. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was up to them. She picked up her tray, ready to slip back into the background, when Charles's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, louder than he intended. All eyes turned to him. His gaze locked on Sophia, and in it was something no one had seen from Charles Whitmore in years, humility. "Don't go," he whispered. I think you might have just saved us." The titans of Wall Street sat in stunned silence. The waitress they had mocked only moments ago had not only held her ground but had delivered the spark of a strategy that could rewrite their future. And for the first time, Charles wasn't the one commanding the room. Sophia was. The days that followed were unlike anything Charles Whitmore had experienced before. The fallout from that fateful evening rippled through the elite circles of Wall Street like a storm no one had seen coming. Investors who had once ridiculed him now spoke with caution, their arrogance tempered by the memory of a waitress who had exposed their blind spots in a single evening. The strategy Sophia had outlined was no longer dismissed as nonsense. Under Victor Lang's validation, it became the foundation of the company's survival plan. Analysts called it radical simplicity. Shareholders, who had nearly lost faith entirely, began to breathe again as whispers spread that Whitmore Enterprises might actually stand a chance. For Charles, the humiliation of that night lingered, but so did something else: respect. Respect not only for Sophia's insight but for the courage it took to speak in a room designed to silence her. Every replay of that dinner in his mind reminded him that leadership wasn't about pride or power, it was about listening, about recognizing wisdom no matter where it came from. He had strutted through life believing brilliance only wore bespoke suits, only sat at polished tables. Sophia shattered that illusion in one evening. The investors moved forward cautiously, but Elaine Crawford was not so fortunate. Her sneering challenge had backfired spectacularly. Whispers began circulating about how she had been so blind, so arrogant, that a waitress had outmaneuvered her in front of her peers. She tried to spin the story, but the narrative had already taken hold. Deals she once commanded with ease slipped from her fingers. Rival firms stopped returning her calls. Her reputation, once untouchable, began to tarnish like silver left too long in the open air. The other executives who had laughed the loudest at Sophia's expense found themselves sidelined in the restructuring process. Charles, humbled and determined to rebuild with sincerity, no longer sought their empty approval. Their voices, once dominant, were now irrelevant. It was not lost on anyone that their mockery had given Sophia the platform to speak, and the contrast between her insight and their arrogance was impossible to ignore. The board quietly reshuffled, pushing them to the margins. Meanwhile, Sophia returned to her life at the restaurant. She didn't chase headlines or seek a place in the corporate spotlight. The tabloids tried to track her down, reporters showed up with cameras, but she refused every interview. To her, the victory wasn't in recognition, it was in knowing she had spoken the truth when it mattered most. She poured coffee, wiped tables, and carried trays just as before, her quiet presence unchanged. The restaurant patrons continued to overlook her, never guessing that she had once silenced titans and saved a billion-dollar company with nothing but her mind and her courage. But Charles didn't forget. Quietly, he visited the restaurant weeks later, no entourage, no arrogance. He asked for Sophia by name, and when she appeared, still wearing that plain uniform, he offered something she never expected, a position on his new advisory team. Not out of pity, not for appearance, but because he finally understood that brilliance often comes from the humblest places. Sophia smiled politely and declined. "I belong here," she said softly. "Not because I couldn't do it, but because I don't need your world to prove my worth. I know what I'm capable of." Her words struck Charles harder than any market loss ever had. For the first time, he realized that success wasn't about clawing for power at the top. It was about integrity, about having the courage to live in alignment with who you are. Sophia had what he had lost somewhere along the way: authenticity. News of her refusal spread quietly among those who knew the truth of that night. It baffled the elite. Why would anyone turn down the chance to leap from waitress to corporate savior? But those who truly understood admired her even more for it. She wasn't defined by their world, and she never would be. Justice, in the end, was delivered with elegance. Elaine's empire shrank, her name whispered as a cautionary tale in the same circles that once applauded her cruelty. The sneering executives who had treated Sophia like dirt learned the sting of irrelevance. And Charles, though humbled, found his second chance, built not on ego, but on humility, forged in the fire of humiliation and redemption. Sophia, however, simply kept living her truth. She became a legend in whispers, the story of the waitress who saved a company told over wine at dinner parties, always with a shake of the head and a sense of wonder. But to the world outside that circle, she remained invisible, slipping between tables, carrying plates, smiling quietly. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all: she didn't need their applause. Her value had never depended on their recognition. She had already proven, once and for all, that greatness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes, it wears an apron and carries itself with quiet dignity. What Sophia proved that night goes far beyond business. She showed that wisdom can come from anywhere, and that true courage doesn't need permission to speak. In a world obsessed with power, wealth, and appearances, she reminded everyone that dignity and clarity can outshine arrogance every single time. And maybe that's something we all need to remember: you don't have to sit at the biggest table to have a voice worth hearing. You don't need a title to make an impact. Your moment, like Sophia's, can come when you least expect it, and when it does, the world won't be able to ignore it. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated, only to surprise everyone with what you were capable of? Share your story in the comments below, and let's build a space where voices like Sophia's, and like yours, are celebrated. And if you want to keep hearing stories of humility, courage, and unexpected triumph, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next story might just be the one that reminds you of your own power.